this Thursday night. So knowing it's almost Hanukkah, already very special, miraculous energy. Very, very, very miraculous energy. We like miracles. We like Hanukkah. We like light. Hanukkah is the victory of light over darkness, and we appreciate that. This week we're going to talk about Rus, but maybe next week we'll take a break from what we just began to talk about Hanukkah. I should write that down because I might forget. I'd love to have a Hanukkah party. I don't know if there's people that would feel safe coming out. I don't know what everyone feels about COVID. Bella, you came to our Sukkot party.
I'm okay to come, tell the truth. I'm okay.
You're not scared. I don't know who else is as brave as Bella in terms of the COVID realities.
I would join you.
You will come, Miriam? Okay, Jenny's a little far. Maybe we'll try to do that, an in-person Hanukkah party. It'd be so nice to do something in person. We'll see everyone's response. In-person party. Come on, it's Hanukkah. Times of light, times of miracles. We'll see. I'll see if people will do it because it wasn't. You remember how nice it was in the sukkah, Bella?
Yeah, exactly. It was so nice.
It was so nice.
Yeah.
It was so nice. It was so nice in the sukkah. Okay, so let's make our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es toraso Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah Ma Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Okay, what we were discussing a minute or two ago was maybe next week we should have an in-person Hanukkah party. Maybe I'll put it out on the group and we'll see how many people feel safe enough to come to my house. But it would be so nice to get together and Hanukkah.
Yes.
Time.
Yeah.
Hava says yes, she's smiling. Hava feels yes. Menucha also can't have a sukkah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, good. I'm glad we're feeling good about it. It's felt like whatever. Won't go there. What's going on in our world between corona and vaccines and elections and I don't know what. God, you're bringing Mashiach. Because this we need Mashiach. All right. So we started last week the book of Ruth. In English, usually called Ruth. And in Ivrit, in Israel, called Ruth. And in Ashkenazic Hebrew, called Rus. It's all the same word. Ruth and Rus is all the same name. Just depends on how you're pronouncing it. So we started the book of Ruth, which means we did background. And we're going to spend the entire day doing more background because there's a lot of concepts. And I was sort of wondering as I was preparing, should I go into all these concepts or should I just dive into the book? But I felt like all of these concepts are really giving you a wealth of just background knowledge on so many foundational ideas that you're probably never going to encounter, or you might encounter but not really know much about them. Now, being me, I think last week in answering questions, I probably jumped ahead to some of the information I meant to give you today. I don't remember exactly well, but I definitely remember some of the things I was going to talk about today I spoke about last week. So hopefully we'll go more quickly because we spoke more at length last week about some of these ideas. Because a lot of these ideas are also very interwoven. One overlaps on the other, so it's sort of hard to dissect. Hava.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
So you said last time that on one side that was Ruth and Bor, and on the other side Tamar and Yehuda.
Mm-hmm.
But can you give us like a little bit, I guess, year or generation? What's a generation? How close in a generation those two are?
Oh, very far from each other. Tamar and Yehuda were 4 generations before the Jews left Egypt. meaning Yehuda was the first that went into Egypt. And then the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years. And then they were 40 years in the desert. So that's 250 years. And then it took 25 years till the era of the judges began. So that's 275 years. And this is 250 years after the beginning of the era, meaning the entire era of the judges was 350. And this is 250 years into it. So 250 and 275 is 525. So I will give you an approximation that this was, obviously, it wasn't exactly 525 because Yehuda and Tamar didn't happen the minute before they entered Israel. It was into Egypt. It was probably like some 25 years before. Well, let me think. I can figure it out because it was a beginning, and Joseph was in Egypt for 22 years. He was separated from his father. 22 years of separation. So it was about, let's say, 20 some years before. No, but then he had to get married and have kids, and I would at this point I'm approximating. I would say it was about 10 years before, but that's an approximation.
Right.
So roughly 535 years, 540 years, 530 years. I'm guessing between 530 and 540 years separated those two events.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thank my brain for figuring that out. I would never have been able to tell you off the top of my head. You have to, like, sometimes we're given a question like that and say, wait, I can figure out this information. Let me just chunk it in little bits instead of being overwhelmed and say, I have no clue, Chava. Okay, we are going to speak about the idea of Yehuda and Tamar and the parallelism and all of that in like more, we discussed it last week and we're going to come back to it today because there's more and more to say about it. And again, if I'm saying things that like, wait, you said all this last time, you can feel free to tell me that because I know I discussed it, but I know I have a lot more I didn't say, but I don't remember exactly how far I got. That's what happens when you jump ahead of yourself. All right, so we were laying the foundations for this book. We're going to be laying the foundations for the entire rest of today. We're saying next week we're going to segue into Hanukkah, which of course we know historically so much about, so we could really appreciate. This is the first time perhaps you're going to enter the holiday and you're going to know the battles and the 25 years and the 100,000 soldiers and Lysias, and you know it all. So that's always nice, coming with a place of really knowing and appreciating on a deeper level because you have so much knowledge about what happened to Hanukkah, more than most Jews out there in the world today. I can't guarantee you, including ones that have been celebrating it their whole life. So now we're talking about Rus. We're going to introduce it. Next week we're going to do Hanukkah, and the next week we're going to continue the introduction because we're definitely not going to finish today. No hopes of that because there's so much background information that once you have a lot of these pieces in place, the work makes a lot of sense and you can understand the dynamics. And otherwise it's very confusing. So we were discussing a lot of things last week that we're going to repeat today in a different level. So the first thing we were discussing that we mentioned last week was the idea that this is a time when the Jews were not doing too well spiritually. As the book opens up and as it also opened up to, this is the Judges, the era of the 350-year era of Judges, which we had discussed and we learned this in history, was a very high time. The book of the Judges is called the book of Hayashar, of the right, the straight, the righteous. Because the Jews, all in all, overwhelmingly were on an amazingly high level. They were on such a high level that for 350 years, they could survive without a central human authority called a king. That's a testimony to their greatness and their moral character. But there were times when they fell. There were three very big times. One of the other two we're going to mention today later. We're going to bring it in. This was the sin of the idol of Micha and the tribe of Dan. We're going to bring it as a point of reference. In all three of those situations, the prophet Shmuel, who wrote with obviously the prophecy, wrote this book, gave the same introduction. It was a time when the judges judged, which, as we said, meant it was a time when the people weren't really listening. The judges were judging and the people were chaotically following. But again, we're talking about three bad things in 350 years. And there were other smaller times, as we said, there was a sort of a cycle, the Jews started slipping, God would send one of the neighboring nations to attack them and conquer them and oppress them. And they remembered and they repented and God saved them. And they were very close to God for a while. And then things started slipping again. But overall, it was a very high time. And I'm saying even their sins overall were on a very, very minor, as we're going to discuss soon. This idea of that something God could call a sin, but really it's a sin. But it's nothing at all like it seems. So that's something to really understand, this idea. But even before that, going back to the like interesting point that I perhaps raised last class, but I don't know if I raised it strongly enough. We're looking here at the story. The beginning of the story is a man's failure, right? We said Elchanan abandons his brethren, right? He goes and he does something horrible. I'm not sorry, I said Elchanan, I meant Elimelech. Sorry, wrong name. I'm not so great with names. Elimelech is doing something horrible, as we discussed last week. It was wrong. Yes, it was wrong. And obviously he had free choice, and obviously he made a very grievous. But God was at work, because only through him doing this do we come to the point of Ruth coming to the Jewish people. And I don't know if that was something I said clearly enough last week. So Elimelech, remember, there's a famine. And Elimelech was very rich, very honorable. He was one of the biggest people in Beit Lechem. And instead of staying there and opening up his coffers to support all of his poor, starving brethren, he said, I can't handle this. And he fled. He fled to a nation that until then was always viewed as the enemy. He fled to the nation of Moab. Moab had always been an enemy of the Jewish people. There was no friendly relationships going on there. So his fleeing to Moab made no sense. Meaning him saying, I don't want to support my brethren. I want to protect my money, and I'm going to go someplace where nobody's going to come knocking at my door and demanding for me to distribute all my wealth. That's a failing. His going to Moab was irrational. The Moabites hated us. Why in the world did he go to Moab of all places? Because there was a hand of God here. And only by his going to Moab do we come to the point of Ruth converting, marrying his son Machlon, Machlon dying, and then Ruth showing that really her conversion was valid. And we're going to discuss this later, hopefully today, because we might have suspected, was it or wasn't it a valid conversion? We only know the truth that it was valid when she stuck with her mother-in-law and went as a poor woman of a poor woman. She could have gone back to being a princess. She's like, no way, I'm sticking with you, I'm Jewish. But this spark that we're going to discuss today, the concept of this spark, the whole reason we said that God did not destroy Moab for 700 years was to release this spark in Ruth. Only by Abimelech doing something so wrong did this, in a natural way, set the place for a Moabite princess to convert to Judaism. Which is a very interesting concept to keep in mind in life. Because what we see here makes no sense. What we see here is someone doing something wrong. And it's true he made a wrong choice. He was wrong. But that doesn't take away God from the picture. And God was doing God's thing as Abimelech was doing his thing. And as the Jews were so upset at him, and Abimelech was so wrong, and the Moabites rejoiced that this Jew had come to them, God was doing his thing. God set this whole stage up to extract that spark for which he had not destroyed Moab for 700 years. So sometimes life looks very weird. It's very confusing. It's very strange. We are, I'm saying, where we live now makes no sense. All the things, the craziness of Corona and the response to Corona, the fear of Corona, which seems crazier sometimes than Corona, and the vaccines and the all the things you hear about the vaccines, so much going on. They're like, what is going on? One thing we know is God. There's a God. People can make mistakes. People do things wrong. But that doesn't ever remove God from being the ultimate scripter, the ultimate playwright of everything happening. the ultimate director of all of the scenes. Elimelech had free choice, but God was at work putting things in motion. And so too always, in the things that seem normal, in the things that seem mundane, in the things that seem routine, and in the things that seem crazy, it's always the hand of God. Sometimes we can see it a little. Sometimes we can't. Doesn't take away, it's always the hand of God. So we're talking here about the sins, meaning on one hand, on a national level, the Jewish people had fallen, which is why God responded with this famine. We said normatively, the cycle was they left God somewhat. Again, they're still very great, but they left God, and then God would send a neighboring nation to attack, to conquer, to oppress. They return, they repent, God brings salvation. Now God did something different. He sent a famine. Maybe specifically, again, because he wants Elimelech to go to Moab, as versus to, some other thing to happen from this. So that shows the Jews were falling. Elimelech abandoned his people. That shows the Jews were falling. But at the same time, we have to always, always, always keep in mind. It is very important to keep this in mind throughout this entire book and throughout your entire learning of anything in Tanakh for sure, anything in the scriptures, in Torah or in the prophets or in the writings. I explained to you last week this classification system and how Rus is one of the writings. Whenever the Torah describes the sins of the ancients, the Torah is speaking very, very, if you will, harshly, very, very strongly about what people were doing. And I mean, there are many examples. I'll give you one. I could give you many, but I'll just give you one. If you want more, I'll give you more afterwards. But a very classical example is with Reuven. Reuven was Yaakov, Jacob's oldest son, Reuben. And we read in the Torah that Rachel died. Just had this. She died in childbirth. And then it says that Reuven sinned with his father's concubine, Bilhah. Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel, that Rachel gave Jacob in marriage to produce children. And she had 2 children with Yaakov. So she was obviously a very great woman, which she was. So Yaakov had 4 wives, Rachel, Leah, and then the maidservant and half-sister of Rachel, Bilhah, and the maidservant and half-sister of Leah, Zilpah. Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah each have 2 sons. Leah has the other 6. Rachel passes away, and the Torah says that Reuven, the oldest son, goes and sleeps with his father's concubine. What's going on? And what makes even less sense is, and then the Torah goes on to say, and the children of Jacob are 12, and enumerates Reuben as the firstborn. Like, what's going on? So the sages explain that, God forbid, Reuven was very saintly. Reuven never did anything anywhere close to that. What did he do? Well, it says what he did was, let's explain back a little why he did what he did. That Yaakov had 4 wives, but his main wife was Rachel. She was the one for whom he got into this whole relationship with the other 3. He came there to marry Rachel. He understood spiritually that Rachel was his destined soulmate, as it's true. Rachel embodied the energy of the Jewish people, and he was destined to marry Rachel. Of course, as God worked it, and with the trickery of Laban, he ended up marrying Leah, and then both of them were childless, which was, of course, as well. He also had Bilhah and Zilpah. But his main wife was Rachel. And therefore, there were 4 tents for the 4 wives. And Yaakov's main residence, his bed, was in the tent of Rachel. That was his main wife. After Rachel passes away, where's Yaakov going to go? So Yaakov decided he's going to move to the tent of Bilhah, because Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel. So she was like the closest thing he could get to Rachel was Bilhah. So therefore he moved from the tent of Rachel, that's no longer operative, to the tent of Bilhah. When Reuven saw this, Reuven is the eldest son of Leah, he was like, it's not enough that her sister, so to speak, is her rival. Her sister's maid, Bilhah? And he was so upset that he took the bed of his father, Yaakov, and he moved it from the tent of Bilhah to the tent of Leah, his mother. Was that right? No, it was not right. Was that sleeping with Bilhah? Nowhere close. But that's what the Torah says about him. Because on his level and on his stature and what was expected from him, moving the bed of his father was akin to having relationships with Bilhah. So I'm just bringing this in as a classical example, and I could give you many, where the Torah says something. The Torah could be in the 5 books or in the prophets or in the writings, and it says something that sounds a lot harsher than what really happened. But again, there's a concept, our sages say, that God judges the very righteous like a hair's breadth, like the breadth of a hair. You can't measure the breadth of a hair, right? It's so small, the dimensions of a hair. That's how scrupulous and exacting God is with the very righteous. So any slight thing that they're doing wrong is judged as per their stature, not as per the act in a vacuum, but as per their stature. So for Reuven's stature, his spiritual stature, this was akin to that. So I'm bringing this in as a point of reference because whenever you learn, especially the prophets and the writings, especially the prophets even more than the writings, because they more discuss what was happening with the Jewish people, often the writings are more allegorical in our relationship to God. A lot of times it sounds like the Jews were really bad. And when it describes the Jews being really bad, the Jews were doing wrong things. But they weren't usually doing as bad as it sounds like, because God is judging them severely because they were on a very, very high level. And so too here, when we're saying the people were being chaotic, they weren't listening to the judges, that's why there was this famine. Elimelech did this great sin for which he died, his sons died, he lost all his wealth. But Elimelech did was wrong. But in our world, it wouldn't be the cause of the person's death and losing all of his resources and his son's deaths. It's nothing, in other words, he didn't transgress an Aveira. There's nothing he did there that went against any of God's 613 commandments or any of the thousands of commandments of the rabbis. But for his stature, it was considered wrong enough that there was this consequence. The Jewish people were doing things wrong. That's why God sent the famine. But again, what they were doing wrong on our level wouldn't even be considered wrong. But on their level, it was considered wrong. So it's just always good when you're learning the book of Ruth or you're learning anything in all of the prophets and the writings to always have this paradigm of like, I can't read this as a literal storyline, lust and blood. I need to really understand it in the teachings of the sages to know what was really going on. Any questions or comments, any feedback on those ideas? Okay. Okay, so there's many examples, but I'm not gonna go into it. I think it's understood.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Menucha.
Yeah. The fact that Elimelech didn't want to share his wealth, is it against the mitzvah of giving charity to poor?
I'm not going to judge him and know if he was or wasn't. In other words, if according to the mitzvah, you have to give a certain percentage of your earnings, right? You have to give at least a 10th. Assuming he gave a 10th, he was technically kosher. Morally, though, he wasn't kosher. Because if you're sitting on, let's pretend you have $100,000 a year. You have a nice amount of money in your bank account. You're comfortable. You have 150,000, you have 200,000, 250,000. You're comfortable. And you give your 10%, no problem. And there's starving people that come to your door. You can't say, I gave my 10th. That's wrong. Well, did you do what God asked you to do? You did, but God also doesn't want you to turn away the hungry. So what if you move away so these people aren't knocking at your door? Oh, well, then you can't say, hey, I didn't feed the hungry. I wasn't near the hungry. Well, you weren't near the hungry because you moved away not to see them. See what I'm saying? In other words, as long as Elimelech gave his 10% to charity, he did his commandment. If somebody's hungry, knocks at his door, he's supposed to feed him. But if he's in a place where there's nobody hungry, what did I do wrong? Why did you move away? Because you didn't want to feed these hungry people. You should have stayed and fed them. It was like we can almost call it like a lack of character, like a lack of moral fiber and backbone. You know, if you're in a hard situation, you're not supposed to pick up and leave. You're supposed to stay there and help. So it was very wrong what he did. And I'm saying it was wrong enough that God took away his life and the life of his two sons who accompanied him. They were already adults. They could have stayed. So they were viewed as guilty also because they went along with him. His wife, Naomi, was not viewed as guilty because her husband went. She followed him. It wasn't viewed as like she was able to stop him. Obviously, if she was able to, I'm sure she would have. She would have a very righteous woman. But he was viewed as guilty, and his sons were viewed as guilty for abandoning their people, enough that God took away their lives and all their fortune. So God definitely said this is incredibly wrong. But I'm saying if you look at it technically, you could say maybe you start picking hairs to find exactly which is the specific transgression. But the spirit of it was completely wrong. And I mean, obviously, we all can understand there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. And it's sort of like there's a story of someone who, whenever a poor person would knock on his door, he would always give him like a very, very rich man and very miserly. And he would always give him like a little copper coin, like probably akin to like a penny or two. And the poor man would always throw it back in his face. You give me a penny? I'm starving. You're living in this rich house and you're giving me a penny? And so it went. Well, I'm always trying to give charity and nobody's accepting my charity. I'm trying. Why are you giving such a small amount? Who said I have to give him so much as long as I'm trying to give charity? You know what I'm saying? So there's like, you can't fool God. You can't just like say, I'm going to follow the letter of the law and I'm going to like circumvent the spirit. No, there's the spirit that is fleshed out by that is within the letter of the law and expressed as a letter of the law. And what we do has to be appropriate to the letter and appropriate to the spirit. If somebody was, I mean, there's so many examples that I could think of. If someone is saying, technically what they're wearing is modest, but it's really incredibly not modest, but technically it's modest. So what are they transgressing? They're transgressing what's called das Yehudis. That there's a spirit of modesty that has to pervade your clothing, not just the technical, your elbows are covered, your collarbone is covered, your knees are covered. There has to be a spirit of modesty that's maybe less tangible, but also very significant. Okay. All right. Okay, the next thing I want to discuss a little bit at length is the idea of the monarchy. And I want to discuss it for two reasons. One, because understanding what was not there in the times of the judges helps us understand why this story took place. And also, it's very relevant because the whole concept of the book of Ruth is to create King David and what God's vision of a monarch. And also, it ties into this whole time when the Jews asked for a king and God's upset they asked for a king, which is very puzzling because in the Torah it says we're supposed to have a king. So it's a little bit obscure, the issue. So I want to discuss it. And again, most primarily to understand how that led, the lack of the king led to the scenario. And in a sense probably led to why Elimelech made his grievous mistake and abandoned the Jews. Again, his mistake was God's plot because God wanted to pull Ruth out of Moab, but it was still on his level, his mistake. So if there had been a king at this time, a Jewish king, as God wants a king to be, the understanding is Elimelech would never have run away, which also ties into why the opening words of this book is at the time when the judges judged, implying there were only judges, there was no king. And since there was no king, Elimelech ran away. Now, why would the absence of a king make Elimelech leave? Because an understanding of why he left was he just felt overwhelmingly burdened and not up to the task of helping all the people of his tribe, at least all the people of his city in Beit Lechem. And that's really a job that the king should have had. Meaning, if there was a king, the king would have been that central figure who would have led the nation, and he would have been the central one that would have pulled them up past and through this difficult time. But since there was no king, the people were turning to Elimelech, and I was like, Elimelech was like, I don't have the soldiers for this. I don't have the power for this. I don't have any official abilities here. Just my own personal bank account. I can't handle this. I'm leaving. Now, why wasn't there a king? So that's, again, a very interesting thing to understand, because in the Torah, in the 5 books, it's written that there's a command to have a king. That's literally a commandment. One of the 613 commandments is to have a king. And it's actually written that there were 3 commandments the Jews were supposed to do when they entered Israel: to appoint a king, to destroy Amalek, and to build the temple. At this point in time, the Jews have done none of that. When the first king that was appointed was King Saul, King Shaul. Then his son ruled. Then David ruled. So now we finally have the real king. Already under the time of Saul, he's fighting the war to destroy Amalek, but doesn't completely destroy them. And in the time of David's son, Solomon, is when the temple is built. So meaning all these things are in the future. The Jews have already been in Israel for 275 years. Because I just said, when Chava asked me that question, that took about 25 years till they started the era of the judges. And the era of the judges was 350 years long, and now it's 250 years into it. So for 275 years, the Jews have been in Israel, and they never pulled themselves together to have a king, which is a command they're supposed to do right away. And it's going to be another 100 years till they have a king. Because we said the era of the judges is 350 years. And when they do get a king in another 100 years from now, God's very upset at them. And Samuel, the last of the judges, is very upset at them that they want a king, which is sort of bizarre. Why is he upset at them for asking for something that seemingly they were supposed to have done 375 years ago? You should be upset you haven't done it for 375 years, not upset that they want it now. And God was also very upset with them. It wasn't just Samuel. God was also very upset with them. Samuel was so upset, and God said, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. God says they're rejecting me by asking for this king. So to understand this idea, what was the problem when they asked for the king? And yet God wants a king, and what type of king does God want? And what type of king were they asking for? So the whole Jewish concept of governing is different than any other country in the world, in a Torah authentic world. Because in a secular world, you could have one man ruling, you could have democracy where you appoint him, you could have a sovereignty inherited, a dictatorship. You could have a few people, as Rome went through stages. Sometimes they had a few people ruling, an oligarchy of a few people ruling. You could have a theocracy of the priests ruling. You could have lots of different forms of government. Judaism doesn't believe in any of that. Judaism says God's the king. The ruler is God. The ruler is not one man, elected, appointed, inherited, took this throne. The ruler is not a few people. The ruler is not a group of people. The ruler is God. The King of all kings, God, he is the ruler. That being said, when God says appoint a king, as he says in the Torah, it's one of the commandments to appoint a king, he wants a king who's going to be expressing his reign. A king who's going to be, exercising some of the work for him as a human. A king, therefore, who the first call is someone who's absolutely nullified to God, who's absolutely devoted to God, who understands his position with absolute humility, that his whole function is to serve God and serve the people and bring the people to God. A king who is serving the people, not ruling the people. A king whose vision of self is impoverished, poor, nothing, just a conduit for God's energies. And whatever I have, I don't deserve anyway. It's interesting. The letter in the Hebrew alphabet that's poor is the Daled. They're really 2 letters, but in a godly way, it's the Daled, which symbolizes Dal. Daled is like the word Dal, which means poor. King David's name, David, begins with a Dalet and ends with a Dalet, to express this idea of his vision of self as Dal. I'm nothing. Whatever I have is just gifts God gave me. My only function is to serve. Yehuda, the father of the tribe of David, the father of the tribe of kings, the letters of his names is God's name, the most essence name of God, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, plus a Dalet, implying the same idea of Dal. It's interesting when Yehuda, the father, ultimate father of King David, the head of the tribe, when he was born, Leah did something very unusual. Leah said, Hapam ode'es Hashem, now I'm going to thank God because I got more than my portion. What did she mean by this? Leah and Rachel and Sarah and Rivka, Rebecca, they were all prophetesses. They all had prophetic spirit. So Leah and Rachel both knew that Jacob, Yaakov, was going to have 12 sons. Those will be the 12 tribes. And Leah knew at this point, even though it's before Bilhah and Zilpah have become married to Jacob, but she knew there were going to be 4 wives. So she knew there's going to be 4 wives. She knew there's going to be 12 tribes. So very simple math. Every wife is going to have 3 sons. 4 divided by 12 is 3. And she had 3. She had Reuben, then she had Shimon, then she had Levi. She had her portion. That's what she said when she had Levi. Okay, I'm done. I'm good. God gave me all of the sons. And then she had Yehuda. She had Judah. She's like, whoa, what's going on here? How did I get another child? I wasn't supposed to get more than 3. 4 wives, 12 sons, 3. You gave me a 4th? Hapam odes Hashem. Wow, God, I'm so grateful to you because you gave me beyond anything I could ever expected. I never expected to have another son. Wow, amazing. I'm so grateful. That's the core energy of Yehuda. His essence energy is hoda'ah, acknowledgments of God, awareness of God, nullification to God. As I said, his name is God's name plus the Daled, the Dal, negation of self, and like, wow, anything you give me is I so don't deserve it. It's so beyond my expectations. And that's why Jews are called in Hebrew Yehudim. Or Yehudi is a Jew. Yehudim are Jews. In the Megillah, not the Megillah Rus, Megillah Esther, with the story of Purim, Mordechai is called the Yehudi. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira. Yehudi, which you shouldn't say is a Jew, but technically means someone from the tribe of Judah. But Mordechai wasn't from the tribe of Judah. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. So why was he called the Yehudi? He's not from Judah. He's not from Yehuda. Because this concept of hoda'ah, this concept of acknowledging God, being grateful to God, seeing God in everything in your life, feeling that you're the Dal, you have everything you received is an undeserved gift. That's the characteristic of every Jew. That's what Yehuda embodied. That went into the energy of his tribe, and this from here can come the kings. Because that has to be the go-to of a king, someone who we're trusting him with so much power. We can only trust a mortal with so much power if he's so saturated with nullification to God. If he's so saturated with the sense of, I deserve nothing. Everything I have is a free gift. Everything I have is undeserved. Everything I have is just God's energy flowing through me. Such a person could be the king, but only such a person, because power corrupts. More power, more corruption. As, of course, we saw when we learned Jewish history. And, of course, we didn't have to learn Jewish history to know it's true. So, for God's vision of a king, it has to be a Yehuda. It has to be someone who's that nullified to him. And it has to be someone who the people also understand as such. And that's why God did not want the king appointed before the Jews conquered the land of Israel. Because if the Jews had gone into Israel with a king at their head, like if Joshua had been a king, instead of their leader, their Rebbe, their spiritual guide, if he was their king, or Moses' son, whoever, then as they're winning all these wars in this very miraculous fashion, just as humans, they would have attributed a lot of power to the king, the warlord, the one who's guiding the troops, the one who's enabling them to have all these victories. And God didn't want them to think of a king that way. That's not the purpose of a king, and that's not what he's doing here. God wanted them to have the king when they had conquered everything through God, when they were settled through God's powers, when they were completely at peace. Now have a king. Because now at this point, you're not looking to a human to protect you from the nations, to lead you in battle. You're looking for a human just to help you connect more to God. And that's the idea of the Jewish king. And the Jews never did this because they never reached that point of spiritual level to be able to be saying, however good we are, we want a king. We want to be even closer to God. And we know the king is a vehicle to come even closer to God. So what happened after 350 years of the judges? What happened is the Jews asked for a king, as they said, we want a king, kechol hagoyim, like all the nations. We want to be like everyone else. They knew the judge, the leader, Samuel, was getting older. And they were scared because there was the neighboring nation of Ammon had a lot of strength. And they were scared that Ammon was going to attack them and conquer them. So they wanted a king to lead them in the wars to protect them from Ammon. God said, that's why you want a king? You're rejecting me. That's what God meant when he said to Samuel, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. That's a rejection of God. A king is not, yes, God wants you to have a king to help become closer to God. As a human model that can bridge the gap between you and God. As someone that brings you to a greater awareness of God. Not as someone that you think has a power of protection in lieu of God's. And that's one of the reasons explained why their first king's monarchy failed. They were given a king. God said, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And the king was Saul. Shaul. In the English referred to as Saul. And he was a very, very, very good person who ruled for 2 years, and his monarchy was destroyed and he was destroyed. And one of the explanations, obviously there's a lot of factors there, but one of the issues was, since in its roots, inherently, how the Jews were asking for a king was flawed, therefore the monarchy that resulted from that was also flawed. And that was the monarchy of King Saul. But after Saul and his son Ishbosheth, it was Avshalom. It was Avshalom. I'm trying to remember, it was Ishbosheth or Avshalom. He had 2 sons, and I'm forgetting which one. So don't quote me which son it was after him. Then we have the kingdom of David, and David did it right. As we said, David with the Dalet in the beginning and the Dalet at the end. David is that Dal, is that person who truly, as we see from the Psalms he wrote, expresses so strongly this sense of it's all about God. Any questions? I just went through a lot of facts sort of quickly. Rena, do you have a question? Anyone have a question? Okay. Now, why are we going into this now? Because we're saying, now that we understand the idea of the king, what I said before, how if there was a king, there were a lot of breakdowns that happened, or not a lot, there were 3 big breakdowns that happened over these 350 years, which is very little over 350 years because the Jews were on a very high level. But in each one of them, the feeling was, if there was a king, a proper king, a godly king, he could have solved the situation. But because there wasn't, it devolved. Why do we think a king could solve the situation better than a judge? There were judges. There was always judges, and the judges were godly people. So why are we saying if they're the king, it would have been different? Because technically, a king has powers like beyond the normative judicial process. Meaning, in Jewish law, to convict someone of a crime is very difficult. You need 2 kosher witnesses and 2 kosher people that gave warning. The same people could witness and warn, but you need 2 witnesses and 2 warnings. If everybody knows. If the person himself says, person comes to court, he says, I feel so guilty, I murdered so-and-so, the court can't try him. If there's no witnesses, no warnings, can't try him. If one person is running after another person with a knife and says, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, and two kosher witnesses, Jewish men, are running after saying, no, you're not allowed to kill him. They're warning him, you're not allowed to kill him. God says no, God says no, God says no. I don't care, I'm going to kill him. You're not allowed to kill him. I don't care, I'm going to kill him. So the victim is running, the wannabe murderer is running, and the two people that warned and are about to witness are running, and they all keep running. And the victim runs into a house, and the wannabe murderer runs after him. And when the two witnesses get into the house, they see the victim on the floor dead, with the murderer's knife in his heart, and the murderer standing over him splattered in blood. And there's nothing the court can do because there were no witnesses. That's how difficult it is in the judicial system as God created it. Because we want to be very, very, very careful when we judge someone else. And only if literally there's two eyeball witnesses that we cross-examine very extensively to make sure they're the real thing, who we ever try anyone. And we say, well, this isn't fair. Someone murdered is getting off scot-free. There's a God. God will deal with him. We trust God for the ultimate judgment. We're humans. We do our part, and we know God takes care of everything. So in a normative situation, when people are doing wrong, it's not so easy for the court system to always exact punishment. But a king has more expansive powers. A king could, in that case, that fictitious case that I just gave, which was quoting Maimonides, who made up that fictitious case, a king could say he should be killed. He killed, he should be killed. And if the king says so, he gets killed. So the king has much greater powers because we're trusting him as this person who is God's representative on this world, that he's going to use those powers wisely. And that's why it's so important that the king be such a God-fearing, nullified, self-negated person, because he does have such powers. So, for example, there was unfortunately a great crime. I alluded before that there were two great crimes that happened during the era of the judges. This situation, the background to the story of Rus, is viewed as a great crime. We don't have any specific crime that happened, though we know the Jews did something wrong to have the famine, and we know Elimelech was wrong in leaving, but it's not as great a crime. But there was something that was viewed as very, very wrong. And this happened, sort of a complicated story, but there was a man named Micha. He obviously was not the greatest person on this planet because he stole from his mother a large amount of money. And as the story opens up in the Judges, he confesses to his mother that he stole like 11,000 shekel. And she said, oh, that money, had dedicated it to make an idol. So obviously she wasn't so righteous either because she wanted to make an idol with all this money. Thanks for giving me back my money. She goes to the smith and she has all that silver melted down and made into two idols. So obviously Micha's wrong. His mother's wrong, and the smith is wrong because he's doing something God absolutely forbids. He's making an idol. The mother takes the idols and she puts them in the house of Micha. So Micha now has these two idols in his house. These are all Jews doing something very wrong. And then Micha first appoints one of his sons to serve the idol, and then some wandering priest, some like homeless person named Yonasan passes by, and he's a Levite. And Micha's like, oh, I'll bring you into my house. I'll pay you 10 shekels a year and give you a clothing once a year. And I'll feed you and house you. And you can be the priest of the idol. The Levite, Yonasan says, okay, great idea. What a deal. 10 shekels a year and food and lodging. And Micha's so happy. He says, oh, God's going to be so happy with me. I have a priest in my house now. All is good. Now, again, this is all completely warped because this is about an idol. And these are Jews. And this is in the time of the judges. And what in the world are they doing serving these idols? So this is very, very off. But then it gets worse. What happens? The tribe of Dan. Now, as I maybe never said clearly enough, when the Jews first conquered Israel, again, there's 12 tribes, and the tribes had to conquer their area. they were given 7 years to conquer and 7 years to settle. So over the 14 years, they were supposed to have conquered all of Israel. Well, it never happened. They never conquered all of Israel. Some of the tribes conquered their territory and they were living there, and other tribes sort of were searching for where to conquer, or were searching for where to conquer their land, and they never got their ancestral land, or only much, much later when, the kings come in. So for hundreds of years, they didn't have their land. Dan was one of those tribes. They didn't have where to be. So Dan was like searching for a place to conquer and settle. And they heard of this town, of this area that's a very good area, and maybe they should go and conquer it, take it away from the non-Jewish hands. This is areas that the whole thing was God gave to the Jews. They just never conquered it. And they could settle there. And when they passed by Micha's house, I don't remember exactly the details, how they find out about his idols and his priest. And they said, oh, what a great idea. Let's ask the priest if God's with us, if we can conquer this land. And they asked Yonasan. He said, yes. He gives them this great, forecast that's going to be really good. They go to the town. They see it's very easy to conquer. They go back to their people. They're like, good news. This is a great town, beautiful land, easy to conquer. Yeah. And, on the way, we saw some idols and this priest, and he gave us great rave reviews that we're going to conquer this. They're like, oh, good, let's get him. So when the tribe of Dan are going back to conquer this territory, they pass by the house of Micha. They steal the idols, meaning these were Micha's, not that nobody should have idols, but we just see what's going on here. They stole the idols from him, and they said to the Levite priest, Yonasan, do you want to come with us to be the priest of these idols? Yonasan said, sure, why not? He's a nobody that's telling him to become the priest of the idols of a whole tribe of people. This is cool. The tribe of Dan goes to this area, easily conquers it, settles down, and instead of giving any credit to God, credited these idols. And they set up a whole house of worship of these idols. And they built a house. These were called the idols of Micha. Micha's, in the dust by now. Now it's the tribe of Dan's idols, made by Micha's mom, but this whole convoluted story here. And the people of Dan were worshiping those idols. Now, that story makes no sense, because how did the Jewish people allow that to be? It's forbidden to worship idols. It's an incredible crime. The idols should have been smashed and destroyed, and anyone that served them was supposed to be killed. So what was going on? So what the sages say was going on is there was no king. So since there was only the governing religious bodies, the Beit Din, the Sanhedrin, now it's very hard within the letter of the law powers to act in this type of situation. Now the truth is, just as the king has beyond the law powers, the Sanhedrin, as of course we discussed the Sanhedrin many times in Jewish history, the Sanhedrin also has broader powers. But the Sanhedrin was very cautious to ever use their broader powers. Kings did, including very righteous kings did in a righteous, godly way. The Sanhedrin almost never did. They didn't feel like that they had really the authority to do that. So this is an example of this idea of when the judges judged, when there was no king. Again, not a king like the nations, not a king who thinks I'm the power, but a godly representative on planet Earth who's going to lead the people, connect the people to God, and who God has entrusted with broader powers in such a situation could have stood up and dealt with it and destroyed the idols of Dan and punished the people, taking them away from idolatry. But because there was no king, no godly king, no king at all, therefore it didn't happen, and that's why such a horrible thing happened in the Jewish people. And similarly, the sense is here, as I said, that if there was a king, the assumption is, first of all, the people wouldn't have sinned and therefore wouldn't have brought about the famine, and Elimelech wouldn't have left, because he wouldn't have felt it was all on his shoulders. He wouldn't have felt like, oh my gosh, because I'm the only one around with money, because I'm the one with this illustrious nobility, I'm the one that's supposed to step up to the plate. I don't feel strong enough for this. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to do this. I'm checking out of here. And the idea was, if there was a king, he wouldn't have felt it was all on his soldiers, because it wasn't. There would have been a king who again has extraordinary powers, a godly king who could have used the powers in the right way and helped the people through the famine, and it would have all been on Elimelech's shoulders, and then he wouldn't have run away. But again, God wanted him to, because that was how we needed to get Rus into the fold. So everything has a purpose, everything is part of the divine plan, but looking at the pieces to understand really what was going on. Any questions on anything I said so far? Okay, I hope that means it was all clear, because it was a lot of information. So we're going to stop at this point, I guess, because I think I gave a lot, meaning there was a lot of different ideas that we just went through now. I think the next thing that we're going to be discussing next week is Hanukkah. And hopefully, again, people can come to the Hanukkah party. I'll put that on our group chat, and we could, people can let me know. Hopefully, seems people were feeling okay with coming to a house and to celebrate Hanukkah and miracles and wonders in our times. We say B'yamim ha'hem bizman hazeh, in those days, in this time. So this is the time of year, and it's just as it happened then, it's happening now. So it's a good time to celebrate the wonders and miracles of then and the wonders and miracles of now, and to open up the stage to turn to God and pull down more. Hanukkah starts Thursday night. So everyone should have their menorahs ready, their candles or oil and wicks ready, and to do that beautiful mitzvah of lighting the menorah. First night 1, the second night 2, with the blessings, etc. It's, if you're not sure exactly how you're supposed to do it, it's written all over the place online, on the boxes of candles you buy. And to really try, and every time, every day, and for every holiday, there's a certain energy that's most accessible. And as we're saying, Hanukkah is miracles. And Hanukkah is self-sacrifice. And Hanukkah is love of God. And obviously, miracles and self-sacrifice and love of God are relevant every day of the year. But on Hanukkah, it's most auspicious, it's most easy to access, it's most easy to draw down into our lives. So as you look at the lights of the menorah, and we say to look at the night lights and understand what the lights are telling you, and they're telling you the story of unbroken chain of self-sacrifice and love of God from the beginning until now, generation after generation after generation, self-sacrifice and love of God. And as we express this self-sacrifice and we express this love, how God responds with his love for us, which we experience as the miracles in our lives. So we should merit to draw down in our times, in these days. We should access the self-sacrifice. We should express that love of God, and God should be able to respond. He wants to respond. We should give him the ability to respond in kind with the personal miracles and with the miracles this world needs now, and with obviously the ultimate cosmic miracle, which is the complete revelation of Mashiach. Should happen now. Thank you so much for joining the class. Thank you so much. I so appreciate everyone that came, and look forward to seeing everyone in person next week. I'm going to put something up on our group. I'm really excited. It'd be wonderful to see everyone. So we'll do this like we've done in the past. Potluck, enjoy Hanukkah, and we'll think of some great stuff to talk about. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. Enjoy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you.